Hi everyone. I've been away for a bit, but while I was gone, something amazing happened. My fourth video for Peasant Bread took off, and I got so many comments and suggestions that I decided that because I'm so much better at filming and with sound, that I would redo the video again to hopefully give you more information and an updated version of the Peasant Bread that I showed you how to make. So come on down to the shore and I'll show you how to make the easiest peasant bread for dinner tonight. This bread is super easy and tasty. It takes about 3 hours, so you need to plan ahead. But don't worry because it only takes a few minutes to mix the ingredients, and most of the time it's just waiting around for the bread to rise. So what you're going to do is start with a big mixing bowl, and you're going to mix in 2 cups of flour, all-purpose flour. You can play around with this recipe and change up the flour or the sugar ingredients, or you could use milk instead of water. There are so many variations to this that you can try and experiment with, and I definitely suggest you do that because each person's taste is a little bit different. But I'm going to make it the way that the recipe calls for. So then we're going to do a teaspoon of active dry yeast. Just going to make a little well right here and put my yeast in. And then I'm going to do a teaspoon of sugar, granulated sugar. And you can, again, like I said, use honey or any other sugar substitute you'd like. But I'm going to make it the way the recipe calls for so that you can see what the end product looks like. And then I'm going to do a teaspoon of salt. And I know a lot of people will say salt inhibits the rise of the bread, and that's simply not true based on my research. So don't get scared. We're going to mix all this together. Let me get my whisk. So then I've got my whisk. I'm just going to whisk all this together so that it's pretty well combined. And then the water needs to be about 110 degrees, or if you stick your finger in it, it's lukewarm. And you're going to want to use filtered water, not tap water, because if you use tap water, it has chlorine in it and that will kill the yeast. I forgot to get my fork. So all you're going to do is mix this together with a fork. Again, this is peasant bread, so it's no knead. So all you're going to do is mix it until it's well combined and that there is no flour resting anywhere on the bowl and it's all mixed together. Now, in my first video, I said that you could make this in the same dish that you bake it in, like a cast iron pan. And I will say that I experimented with that and it didn't go so great. So you can do it, but to me, it just doesn't rise the way that this version rises because it needs to rise twice, basically. So once this is all mixed together, what you're going to do is let it sit and rise for about 2 hours so that you can go outside and do some other chores. And then when you're ready to make dinner, you move this to another pan that's coated with butter or oil or whatever you choose and let it rise for another half an hour before you actually bake it. So that's why this takes about a total of 3 hours, because then you have to bake it for about 30 minutes. So as you can see, this looks pretty well combined. I'm just going to let this rest for, like I said, 2 hours. I'm going to cover it up with a tea towel and let it sit on the stove or in a warm area in your house. If it's a little cold in your house, put it up on top of a cabinet because heat rises, so that will help make the bread rise. Now, if you're having a problem getting it to rise, I've tested this and it does work. Put your oven on the lowest possible temperature, like 100 and mine goes down to about 170. That's the lowest it'll get. Let it heat all the way up to 170 and then turn off the oven and then put your dough with the tea towel in the oven and let it sit in there for like an hour, and that will definitely help it rise. So after about an hour, if you don't see a lot of rise in your bread, put it in the oven. Well, preheat the oven and get it up to temperature, to the lowest temperature that your oven will do. Again, mine is 170. And then put the tea towel over it, and in the oven, turn off the oven, put the tea towel over it, put it in the oven, and let it finish rising in the oven for another hour. So that's your 2 hours of total time of rise. And hopefully you'll get at least a 50% more rise than what is sitting here right now. So let me just zoom in on this bread so that you guys can see what it looks like right now. So this is what it looks like right now. And all you're gonna do is cover it with a tea towel and then put it in a nice warm area, or like I said, in the oven, in a turned off oven, and give it 2 hours, and then I'll be back in 2 hours to show you how much it rose. So thanks for sticking around. It's been 2 hours and the dough has risen about 50%. Let me bring it up to you guys to see. So as you can see, it has risen 50%. Now, I will say I had to do what I suggested earlier, and that was to put the oven on the lowest setting, preheat it until it got to temperature, turn it off, and then I put this in the oven for the last hour of the rise, because it's just too cold in this house right now because it's still winter time. So I'm going to now move all of this to the center of the bowl. I have pre-oiled this cast iron baking pan. I used avocado oil to pre-oil this cast iron pan. And now what you're going to do is this loaf will form to whatever it's baked in. So I'm just going to pull it to make it look like a loaf. You don't have to go crazy with it. It will eventually take the shape of the pan. So we're going to, again, let this sit for a half an hour. I'm just going to put it on top of the oven here. So I'm going to let it sit for 30 minutes. And at this point, you could start making your dinner. And if it is a casserole, you could throw it in with the casserole at the same time, because you're going to bake this for 30 minutes at 350 degrees. I would say however long it takes you to preheat your oven, do that before the 30 minutes is up. That way, when the oven is ready, you can just throw the bread in. So we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. While we wait for the bread to rise again, I figured I should give you guys some quick tips to help you be more successful with this bread recipe. Now, in the very beginning, when I said you need to use a warm spot, that is because we need warmth to activate the yeast. So if you're going to use active dry yeast like I did, that actually takes longer. So you'll notice that I had a 50% rise, but it still wasn't that much of a rise. If you use instant dry yeast, you may get more of a rise on your first time through. And you may not have to put it in the oven like I did to try and activate the yeast to get it to rise. You can also swap out the all-purpose flour for bread flour to give it a more chewy texture. And when this bread has cooled and you're ready to store it, you should really store it in a cloth bread bag in a bread box, which is what we do. It makes it last for at least a week before it starts to get funny. It may get a little stale, but it still tastes great, especially if you toast it. And you can also use a paper bag, but it really needs to be in a bread box to help it last longer. If you just keep it in a bread bag or a paper bag, you're probably not going to get that 5 days before it starts to get funny. If you want to store it longer, you could freeze the dough and then let it cool in the fridge, and then take it out of the refrigerator to room temperature, and then you're ready to bake it. Also, I pulled out one of my glass dishes because this is what I use if I don't use my cast iron pan. I would use this dish also, but I don't like to use the metal baking pans because, again, they're made out of metal. And I know that the glass container doesn't seep into the bread. Now, the cast iron pan does seep iron into the bread, but that's actually good for people who are pregnant, who might have an iron deficiency, or anybody else that might have low iron. Now, if you have plenty of iron in your system, it's not going to hurt you at all. But think about that. If you're iron deficient, cook in a cast iron pan as much as possible to help boost your iron intake. Again, it's minuscule, but it does help. So I think those are the tips that I have for now. I'll see you in about 30 minutes. Well, probably about 25 now. And we'll see what it looks like before it goes in the oven. Okay, so we're ready to bake. It's been 30 minutes and the crust has risen again. Let me show you here. I would say it's not, bring it up there. So as you can see, it didn't raise too much more. And the reason it hasn't risen a lot, which actually looking up close from what it was, yeah, I'd say I got about a 25% rise. And the reason I'm not getting a great rise is because I didn't use the instant dry yeast. I used active dry yeast. And that takes longer to rise. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add water to the top of the crust. And the reason for that is because I want to see if I can get more of a rise out of this dough than if I don't do anything at all. So there's ways to change the bread recipe, and I talked about that in the beginning, but I'm going to give you guys some little tips on how to change the crust and how to change the consistency of the bread. And if I'm a little out of breath, I'm sorry. I was outside playing with Rocco, trying to keep him busy. Basically, if you add milk to the recipe instead of water, what's going to happen is milk enriches the proteins and the fat in the dough. And that will result in a softer crumb, and it'll also have a more aerated texture compared to the water. If you baste the top of the loaf with milk, it will create a velvety texture and it'll create a browner crust. So if you don't like so much of a brown crust, I wouldn't suggest using milk to coat the top of the bread, but you could use it inside the recipe as opposed to the water. Now, honey you can use to replace the sugar, but honey is sweeter and it's also slightly acidic, and that's going to affect the leveling of the dough. So you may have to add some baking powder to help with that. And you should probably reduce the amount of honey that you use in the recipe because, again, it is sweeter than sugar. Now, if you baste the top of the dough with an egg wash, it's going to make the dough have a deep hue, and it's also going to have a glossy sheen to the crust. And using the egg wash over the crust is going to tenderize the gluten strands, making the texture more moist and soft. Additionally, the egg protein's content improves the dough's ability to retain gas, leading to a lighter, fluffier loaf. And also, it's important to use a lower temperature if you're using an egg wash because it could cause the crust to burn. Now, if you baste honey on the top of the loaf, it can enhance the flavor, the texture, and the crust. It can add sweetness and moisture, making the bread more soft and flavorful. Additionally, when it's applied as a glaze, honey can contribute to a golden brown crust and a shiny finish due to the Maillard reaction, which is a chemical reaction between the amino acids and reducing sugars that occurs during baking, enhancing the bread's color and aroma. Now, basting with water, which is what I'm going to do, helps delay the formation of the crust, allowing the bread to expand and develop its shape better. This technique is often used to promote oven spring, which is a rapid expansion of the dough in the early stages of baking. Water also serves as a solvent and a dispersing agent for ingredients like salt, sugar, and yeast, and it's necessary for the yeast fermentation and reproduction. Additionally, water can be used to create steam in the oven, which enhances the crust color and shine through the Maillard reaction and caramelization. So now that I have coated the top of the crust, I'm going to put this in the oven. And I'll set a timer for 30 minutes. And I will show you what it looks like when it's all done. Now, when the crust turns brown and you tap the loaf and it sounds hollow, it is done. So start at 30 minutes, and if it's not quite ready, you can go up to 35 minutes. Now, I also want to show you this. It is the bread bag that I purchased. I got this from Amazon. It came in a 2-pack, and I will link this below because this is what I use to put our homemade breads in to keep them fresher longer. Not only do I use this bag and pull it tight, I also put it into a bread box, and that helps keep it fresh for the most part 5 days. Now, on the 3rd day, you pretty much have to toast the bread. It's starting to get a little stale, but it still tastes great. It's just that the consistency is a little different. So I'll see you back here in 30 minutes. So the timer's gone off, so I'm going to take the bread out of the oven now. And it has been 30 minutes to be exact. And it's definitely done. I can tell by the crust, and I can tell by the way that it's thumping that the bread is done. So I'll bring it over there so that you guys can see what it looks like. Again, I used water to put on top of the dough to hopefully give it a better rise. And I really don't think I got much of a rise out of it. Maybe like a 1/4 inch, but I'll bring it over and let you see what it looks like. So that is the dough. And you can see that it didn't get to the top. We'll take it out of the pan and we'll see what it looks like on the cooling rack. These silicone spatulas work great for this. There we go. Lost a little bit of crumb there, but that's okay. So that is the finished bread, and I'm going to let this sit for 20 minutes to cool before slicing into it. And I know it's going to be hard. You're going to want to cut into it right away, but I'm telling you, it's worth the wait. And you know how it is when there's people in the house that smell fresh bread. They're going to say, cut into it. Just tell them to be patient, because in 20 minutes, it's going to be fully worth it. So I'll see you back here in 20 minutes, and we'll cut into it and put a little butter on it, and we'll see how it tastes. So it's been 20 minutes. We're going to cut into the bread and see what it looks like, what it tastes like. Well, but I'll know what it tastes like. You won't. But and I also want to show you this cool bread cutter that I have. So before I take it off of the cooling rack, this thing opens up like this. And then you can put these in here like this. And then you put your bread in there. We'll put it this way because I broke the end of it. And you pretty much line this up, make it nice and snug. And it makes it easier to cut your bread and have even slices. So I'll start on 2. And then we'll go to 3. Oops. And I will show you the slices that it created. So the first one always has the end cut. But look at that. Perfect size for a sandwich. So I'm going to get some butter and put it on there, and I'll give you a close-up of what the bread looks like as well. There is a close-up of the bread. And there is a close-up of the slice. Oops. And let's put some butter on this. See that? Oops. I'll give it a taste. Tastes great. It's not too dense. It's the crust is it's not extremely crispy, but it's just got enough of a crust on it to be, in my opinion, the way that I like things. My husband likes his crust done a little bit more, so I could have used one of the other options to give it more of a darker crust, either the honey or the milk or the egg wash. But for me, this is the type of bread that I like. I like a lighter crusted bread than he does. He likes a darker crusted bread. So all in all, I'd say if you want to make a homemade bread for your dinner tonight, then this is the easiest recipe you could absolutely do, besides putting it in a bread maker. Because what I did was mix the dough, let it sit for 2 hours. I went outside and I started putting together the weed barrier on my Vago raised garden bed, and that'd be a video coming up soon. And then when I came back in, I moved it from the dish that I mixed it in to the cast iron baking pan. And then I waited another 30 minutes to let it rise again. And then I baked it for 30 minutes. So all in all, it's 3 hours from start to finish. And you can bake it with a casserole in the same oven if you're making a casserole for dinner. So it's a super easy, you really can't mess it up. You don't get a great rise like a normal bread, but if you want bread for dinner that night or tonight, then this is the recipe for you. So again, that's it. A new and improved video on how to make my version of peasant bread. It's fresh, it's homemade, and it's super easy with no kneading needed. Say that 3 times fast. No kneading needed. I'm planning to make a bread making playlist with lots of recipes so you can bake bread from home, save money, and enjoy healthier bread because you know exactly what's in it. And it'll be all types of breads. It'll be Italian, artisan, sourdough, regular yeast bread. So the playlist will be pretty significant, I think. But I'll also do videos in between, like the raised garden bed weed protector that I'm doing. So keep an eye out for those. But for now, look at the playlist right here. And if it doesn't show up, I'll put it in the description below as well. I'll be back soon with another bread recipe. And until then, keep learning, planning, working towards self-sufficiency, and hopefully you'll visit us down the shore again. And if you don't believe that the bread tastes good, Rocco gives it his seal of approval. So we'll see you next time.